All righty. So, good morning, afternoon, evening, everybody, and thanks for joining us today. We are living in exciting times. In the last decades, biotechnology has been the key for the cost reduction and increase in the production resilience of a lot of compounds, including medicines like insulin and vaccines, and commodity compounds like dyes, for example. But nowadays, nowadays, biotechnology tools are that enable these very revolutions are getting more and more accessible to the many. And what this means is that modify the DNA and build with biology is not anymore only in the hands of academics and companies in the wealthiest countries, but are more and more accessible to schools and any researchers in the low-income countries as well. So what does it mean in the broader terms is that, yes, we are enabling researchers in the low-income countries as well to have the ability to tackle still unresolved regional challenges, but we are also opening the possibility for any person in your country to edit the DNA and build with biology. So let's have a chat about this, because this is huge and it is going to be something that we will have to face more and more in the upcoming decades, centuries if you want. And I'm very happy to have here with us today a very exciting panel. So we have Jenny Molloy, Shuttleworth Fellow working on open science at the Biotechnology Department of University of Cambridge. She's also Director of Beneficial Bio. We have Fernand Federici, Assistant Professor at PUC from Santiago, Chile, involved in open science project TechnoX and GOSH. Then we have Lencina Agbo, PhD student at Newcastle University and collaborator of Boa Lab, a bio-community lab in Cameroon. Verena Eiraine, PhD students at Cambridge University studying open science, governance of emerging technologies, and do-it-yourself practices. We also have Betak, director of GenSpace, the first bio-community lab in New York City. And last but not least, Joe Egende and Leo Kaufman, directors of the Netflix miniseries Unnatural Selection. And I'll begin by asking each panelist a question, and we will proceed with the questions that will appear on the chat. So feel free to type yours in as we go, and we will answer them at the end. So let's dive in this extremely exciting and complex issue. So I will probably start a question to ask a question to Jenny. So in your research, you are making tools to make biotechnology accessible to the many. So why? What is the drive behind your open source project that we know they cover both hardware and wetware together in the biotechnology side?
Thanks very much, Chiara. Yes, so our work tries to make the enabling technologies for doing biotech and engineering biology available to many people working in low resource context. And that doesn't always mean in the global south or in developing countries, but also in labs that just have fewer resources for all sorts of reasons, including in educational institutions and high schools. So we develop tools because we think that it's important everybody has the ability to innovate and shape the future of biotechnology. And at the moment, there's really only a very small subset of people in the world that have the knowledge and the tools and the kind of power and structure and enabling infrastructure to be able to actually work with these types of technologies. And we've seen in other technologies that when you have a very small group of people that are innovating and kind of building the future of that technology, it doesn't always work for everybody. So it's really important to have different people's perspectives, different people's ideas from all over the world. And so that's really what motivates the work that we do, is really the idea of kind of increasing access in order to have solutions and technologies that benefit more people and solve more problems, because all of us have different priorities and different kind of issues in our own contexts that could potentially be solved by biotechnology. We also have our own concerns in our own context. And so if you're able to develop the technology in these different places, we hope that in the end, what emerges is a biotechnology that is more useful for more people and solves more problems for society and for our planet. And so that's the kind of big picture. And the reason that we work on the tools side is because, you know, there's a lot of other technologies for which democratization is very important. So you think of software and digital technologies, you need things like internet access. You need things like access to low-cost computers and smartphones. And we're really seeing that emerging across the world now. And indeed, many countries are kind of leading the way in terms of mobile technologies and taking a lot of stuff into mobile, like banking. But what we're not seeing really is that proliferation of biological technologies. And one of the reasons is that you need a lot of stuff to do biology. You need the biological systems, you need the organisms, you need DNA, and you need equipment. So, you know, typically speaking, with one computer, you can manage a whole bunch of different projects. But for every project that you do in biology, you often need different types of equipment, different types of chemicals. And so it's really difficult if you're in a setting where the supply chain is constrained to get hold of all of that stuff. And so we kind of try and span across this idea of like big picture policy thinking of what's the future of biotech and how do we distribute that and kind of change the geography of innovation in biotech. But then at a very low level, how do I get a machine on my bench that will allow me to extract DNA from this plant? Or how do I get the DNA on my bench that I need to produce useful enzymes for all sorts of purposes? We work particularly on enzymes that are useful for biologists. So biologists usually start with taking an organism, say a crop, plant, they want to extract the DNA and they want to basically read that DNA to understand more about the crop, to understand how it could be potentially improved. And all of this basically needs a whole set of tools and technologies. And so that's where we focus our attention. And I think that kind of pragmatic aspect often gets overlooked. And I'm sure we'll hear later in the event about some of the challenges that brings up, not only in terms of, you know, the bench scientist and how they go about their daily work, but the types of science that they're able to do, the types of projects that they're able to do, the speed at which they're able to innovate and get those innovations to the market. And so all of this is influenced by really mundane things, in a sense, like supply chains and the wait for importation of goods and cold chain shipping. I mean, all of the things that we've been seeing in the last year are causing huge issues for COVID testing and vaccination, have been playing out for decades in terms of access to these fundamental tools for doing science. And so that's really the motivation, is that more people should be able to work with this, and they're not able to for really stupid reasons. So our approach to try and change that is to encourage the publication of protocols for local manufacturing of some of these reagents. You're never going to be able to make everything all over the world. We rely on resources that are geographically constrained. And sometimes you just need someone who's making a lot of it to make it economically viable. But there are some things in biotechnology which could be made on a small scale locally, and that cuts out all of your travel time. It's much more sustainable. It cuts out customs and importation duties. It cuts out a lot of the weight, and it also builds up an industry and a skilled workforce and a kind of a greater capacity for innovation and for building around these things. And so we focus on the biological tools angle, but we work with organizations that are thinking about how do we manufacture diagnostics in countries in Africa that have really struggled in this last year to get hold of the testing that they need. We work with organizations that are thinking about how do we work on diseases and crops that are really only of primary interest here in the country that our collaborators work in, and are just not really on the radar of international organizations or researchers in other countries. So those are the types of groups that we try and reach out to and really try and build a kind of ecosystem, because one piece is not going to solve the whole thing. We work on a tiny piece of it, which is trying to make sure that some researchers have access to some of the tools that they need. And we hope that kind of others will pile in and try and fix some of the other problems. But yeah, that's the sort of motivation behind what we do.
Thanks so much, Jenny. And building on this, Fernan, you obtained your PhD in Cambridge, for example, university, and now you're assistant professor in Chile. So you've seen, you have done, like research, like in like exactly in UK, and then now in Chile. How is it doing research in Santiago, Chile, and how open science is actually is currently supporting or helping your research. And yes, what's your take on it, on this?
Yes, thanks, Kiara. Yes, absolutely. I mean, science in the region is very good. We work a lot with in Chile with collaborators in Argentina, Peru, Brazil, and science is very good. But of course, doing science sometimes is difficult for many reasons. But I would like to focus to the one related to the topic of today's panel, that is the access to technology, the access to different tools. And despite the fact that open science, in the sense of open access to publication and open access to data, is very good and very welcome, still we need much more than that. We need access to the infrastructure to generate knowledge. And what I mean by that is having access to the hardware, the devices, the enzymes that Jenny was mentioning, the reagents, how to make our own reagents. For instance, now the infrastructure to generate this knowledge, in the case of buying a scientific device, most of the time comes from the US, Europe, or China. It comes as a black box that we cannot repair, adapt, study, and that's not, of course, it's very limiting. So then you have open technologies as part of this big umbrella of open science. And open technology has been super useful and enabling for our research and teaching. For instance, being able to create our own fluorescence microscopes that basically is a mix of different components and technologies that we take from a forum, from a GitHub repository where people describe and document their development. So you can grab different parts of different projects and create your own. For example, in this fluorescent microscope, using components that were used for another purpose, for the transilluminators to see genes, DNA, to see DNA in gels, and then you can repurpose that to make a microscope. You can attach cameras with open libraries to program and take time lapses, and of course, depends on what type of data you need. You can, based on that need, you build around with open technology the sort of devices and infrastructure that you need, and it's very useful. You can then feed back into the community saying, hey, I did this, we think is good for this certain sort of experiments. In the context of biological reagents, is the same situation. For example, having access to the open bioeconomy and the Reclone network allowed us to create our own enzymes for teaching, for diagnostics, for DNA monitoring. In the case of teaching, to give you an example, last year we had to, basically under lockdown, we had to teach practical courses, and in a matter of, I would say, a month and a half, we were able to put together a lab in a box and send it to the house of each student. And that was possible because we have all these connections with different communities of open source technology. Some people that help us with fluorescence detectors to build our own, and they send us some as well, so we can detect reactions and detect GMOs at home. The enzymes from the Open Bioeconomy Lab to produce our own reverse transcriptase, and the enzymes for the famous RT-PCR, so students can make these experiments at home. So it was just possible because we were connected to all these communities that document very well each of the protocols to produce these resources. So it's easy from our end to reproduce that technology and have access to that infrastructure. So I will say open science is critical for us, and it has been super useful in the context of this pandemic.
Thanks, Fernand, for your for reviewing this. And I would like to move on a similar but geographically different side of it. So I will ask Lanchina. You've been a researcher in Cameroon for long, and now you're doing your PhD at Newcastle University. So you've been doing research in very different ways, in very different environments. So what role do you think open science has now, and what role will have in the future for researchers in Cameroon?
Right. Thank you very much, Kiara. Well, simply put, it's not my intention to kind of compare the UK and Cameroon, but when it comes to science, it's more like day and light. And I speak out of experience because I've been a researcher in Cameroon and here in the UK. So back home, if you order something, let's say you're doing your research and you order something, it comes the next day. For us, would have to verify because it's not possible for you to get your stuff the next day. So the only thing we'd want to think is that thing that you received, it's probably not a good one. But that is something that is very common here in the UK. You order something today and you get it the next day. So I'm just like, wow, this is just amazing. And open science in Cameroon, I think now and in the future, it's more like a redemption. I don't know. It's a wave that's going to bring about a lot of change, a lot of innovation. So first off, there are so many issues that researchers in Cameroon and Africa as a whole that they face. So you have the issue of getting the resources and the equipment and also the time. So I'll take myself as a case study. While doing my MSc back in Cameroon, I needed some enzymes that I ordered from the UK. And first off, I had to wait for a very, very long time, considering the fact that I just had to
Sorry,
tell.
how long? Just to give a time
Right.
frame.
I'd say like 3 months. Like 3 months. So I finally got the enzymes, and on that fateful day, I had to go all the way to a different city to pick it up. And I couldn't get it immediately because they had been withheld by the customs. So even though we had everything to prove that they were exonerated because they were for research purposes, after maybe like 2 hours of deliberation, I finally got them and I was rushing back to the lab. So there was that uncertainty of whether we're talking about enzymes here, and they've been out there, they weren't stored properly. They've been out there for a while. There's that uncertainty of whether or not that reagent you've been waiting for 3 months, they're going to work. Well, thank God they did work. But then I'd been waiting for 3 months just to get those enzymes. And let's say if those enzymes had not worked, I would have had to tailor my research based on the things I have. So it's a bit limiting when it comes to the type of research that comes out of Cameroon. We can't actually do what we want to do. We'd have to stick with me to research. But here is open science telling us that we can pick up stuff from the kitchen, from the bathroom, and we actually construct or we do these things that we need. I no longer have to wait for 3 months. I can just put things together and I have what I need. So that is something that I believe it's like a dream come true for every researcher in Cameroon. So that's one thing. The wait will no longer be there. We will no longer have to stick to me to research. It gives us like the space to think, to innovate, because right now we just copy. We just see someone do something somewhere and we copy that. We can't say we want to do something that's new because we don't have the equipment, we don't have the resources. But with open science, especially the hardware, we can just sit and get back in the Mboa lab, we do have a functioning incubator. You'd be amazed on things that would limit students and researchers back home, simple things like incubators that are all over the place. Most labs do not have that. But with the open software and hardware project, the incubator that we have, nothing stops any researcher from making that from scratch, provided that the resources, it's easy, like locally sourced resources used for that, and the information and the protocols are out there and free to use. So I think it's just amazing. Now and in the future, open science it's a wave that will take researchers to a different level. And maybe one day, researchers in Cameroon would also have a say on how science is done and not just being told how to do it.
Thanks, Lencina. That's really interesting and view that needs definitely to be considered worldwide, because you're talking about something that is not just limited to one country, right? It's a technology that can help, can do much good all around the world. But we and now we move something maybe on a different aspects of it. So we were saying like it can help, like research, open science can help researchers to do actual research, but also being open means that it can be done in schools and can be teach, can be a tool to actually education. So I would like to ask Beth. Beth is the director of GenSpace, the world's first community biology lab in New York. And GenSpace on the website says it's a safe and inclusive community where all people can experimentally learn, boldly create, and meaningfully grow with the life sciences. So I would like to ask Beth, how many people you found interested in trying out genetic engineering, for example, and what are their thoughts, approach to it?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I just want to thank the other panelists too for setting us up for a great conversation, because I think a lot of the things that you all said resonated hard around open science really being a tool for community empowerment. And that's definitely the way that we see it here. And so I'm here in the lab. You can kind of see behind me, we have a couple of people who are working on a project right now. So yeah, our thinking in terms of who we are, who we serve, how we go about our teaching, learning, and practice. We've had about 7,700 people since we actually started tracking the number of people that come through our classes over the past like 8 or 12 years. That have learned with us, have taken a class, have gotten hands-on with CRISPR, synthetic biology, biodesign, bioinformatics, like all of these kinds of emerging fields. About 7,000 people have come through our doors to learn one of those skills and take that with them wherever they go. We've also had about 140 people who've been members at the lab since our start. And again, those people have been artists, designers, computer engineers, hardware engineers. You know, everyone from all walks of life is welcome to come to the lab. And what I think is really special is the way that they each bring their lived experience and their special knowledge to the creative practice. And so it really is this kind of super duper interdisciplinary space where people innovate because they're bringing together these expertises that usually live in these silos. So there is something really magic about that for me as a recovering academic, like that was not something that I saw in my academic experience, right? Like you didn't see people, you know, a product designer who's interested in like sustainable materials wants to work with a genetic engineer to see if they can, you know, change gourd shape using CRISPR. Like that's not a thing that you would ever see in a traditional academic lab. So it's magic here. And most of the people who come in and out of our space are pretty tech positive. They really believe that science and technology are poised to change the world for the better. And I think that's also like an angle that we're trying to work on, is really building out critical capacity, critical conversations, and how do we make sure that as this technology happens, as it gets democratized, that we are also thinking about equity, equitable access, who is being represented in those conversations and who's being left out. And so that's really a big part of what we're kind of thinking about now, and especially kind of understanding our role in New York City's ecosystem, is how do we do a better job of understanding the risks, the benefits, and for whom, and really making space for science as a tool for social justice. So that's my spiel. Thanks.
Thanks to you, Beth. Anybody that in your experience come to actually want a genetic engineer, like, I don't know, like, yeah. Are they scared or like?
Yeah, there are a handful of people that sometimes hear, oh, you have a community lab? What's that all about? And they are a little bit nervous. But I think once you step into the space and you see like, this is a really welcoming place. You know, you've got like gadgets, you've got gizmos, but it's got kitchen, like commercial kitchen tabletops. So it feels a little bit like a kitchen when you walk in. And so there is something kind of loosely familiar when you walk into this space. You know, there's soft things, there's games, like it's a place where you can feel like, oh, I could see myself tinkering around in this place. So it's
nice.
Yeah.
Hopefully, whenever this will be over, we will be able to travel to New York to visit GenSpace as well. Okay, thank you so much, Beth. And Leo and Joe, so 2 questions for you, actually. I don't know who wants to take which question, or both of you, because so in your documentary series, which I really, really like, so it's called Unnatural Selection. People, if you haven't watched it, please go and have a look, because it's really interesting. So in this mini series on Netflix, you have done a brilliant job pulling together different points of view regarding genetic engineering and access to the technology. So, and you put together, unfortunately, we cannot invite everybody on the planet, on the panels, but you've been here, biohackers, researchers in different countries and contexts, and representatives of the green movement, and pharmaceutical CEOs. So, what, after putting all this, and I know that it's a big question, but what are your personal thoughts on making genetic engineering available to the many? And what do you think is mostly lacking, and you would like to see happening in the near future? So,
thank you. And thanks for watching the series. But you know, I think that when we talk about genetic engineering, gene editing, gene therapy, gene drives, there's a lot of nuance. There's a lot of complication. There's a lot of it's a big umbrella. So I think generally speaking, it's important to discuss the nuances and the complications, and we're not going to get into all of that here today. But I think in a real way, it's a case-by-case basis. You really have to look at what are we talking about? What's the technology? What are the implications? What are the ethical implications, the economic implications, the medical implications? There's a lot to look at. In general, and Lior can speak for himself, but I think in general, our as filmmakers and as individuals, I think our main goal with the series was to create a discussion about these technologies, because anytime there's something that comes along that is very powerful, that could change almost every aspect of our lives, we need to discuss it. It's a good idea to discuss it. And a lot of times, especially when it comes to science, because of the nature of science and the difficulty of science and the expensiveness of science, sometimes the conversation only remains in the lab or in the university, and so our hope and our drive with the series was to bring it out of the lab and have people discussing these things at home and with their family and with their friends, because it really will touch all aspects of our lives. So in general, I'm for progress. I'm pro science. I believe gene editing and genetic engineering is going to obviously change the world and humankind. But I think along the way, we need to continue to check in and discuss what the implications are. Like Beth said, the equity of it, who's it available to and who isn't it available to, both the tools and the results of the tools, the medical implications. So, Lior, I don't know if you want to tag on to that.
I can follow up a little bit and then go to what we maybe sense is lacking a little bit. I think that also when we encounter it first, the general subject, and of course, we heard about CRISPR. This is already, 5 years ago. I think it was still, and to a degree for many people, was still this conversation of as one topic, as one big thing. It's kind of like conversations about internet, good or bad, 20 years ago, right? And these things it's not one thing, right? And I think that we tried in the series, one of the things that we try to do in the series is to show, first of all, that it's not one thing, right? It's not, I'm for gene editing or I'm against gene editing. There's applications, there's differences. Every little thing has advantages, disadvantages, things that can work well for people, things that that might create problems for people. So I think that's a big part of the evolution of discussion, and I think people should discuss it more and explain that more. I think that what we also tried to do, as you mentioned and Joe already mentioned, is to bring various opinions that sometimes obviously disagree into the screen, and we felt that the best way to bring the viewer into the subject is to kind of create a little bit of a roller coaster of feelings, emotions, of thoughts, while you go through many persuasive people who are telling you completely different things. And what I think is a little lacking, and I sincerely felt it more after the show came out, and after the show came out, the public had very good reactions to the show and was very interested, and we felt that it's evoking that kind of conversation and further Googling and further trying to understand things. But what we felt a little bit from entities is everybody wanted their narrative to reign over the other. And it's not that I don't understand it. Of course, you know, first of all, it's hard for us to strike a perfect balance. And I think part of it is understanding that none of us in any panel or any series or anything, we can never strike a perfect balance and bring every opinion. But I think what's important for us to move forward, and in that sense, I will say, like Joe, I'm for good technologies moving forward that can help all of us, is that even if you feel very strongly about something, and when you're talking about science, I can understand how a scientist feels very angry when he feels that some opinion is not factually based, and it's maybe hard for them to have a conversation about it. But I would like to commend, and by that show an example of what we want to see more, I think, as representative of the general public here in a way. Dr. Kevin Esfelt from MIT, who is featured in the show, and his approach is always to talk about it with everybody and accept also criticism that maybe as a scientist, he doesn't know, he doesn't necessarily have the tools to deal with it immediately, because like he says in the show, in a certain episode, a lot of times the criticism is not scientific, it's about values, it's about what people fear, it's what people believe in. And I think that, but I think that if we want to move the technology and we want to enable a healthy way to move forward for everybody, I think that everybody should enable that conversation. And I think, you know, the mainstream scientists have to be okay with being on a panel with the green environmentalist movements that are anti-GMO, and they have to be okay with being with them on panels, and biohack and being okay with bringing the biohackers in, and biohackers have to be okay with each other, because there's also a lot of different opinions within that space. I think that there's, because maybe it's new and people, and again, we understand there's people invest their lives in it. People feel that it's very important what they're doing. There's also a lot of money in it for certain people. But I think everybody will make a mistake if they try to control the narrative. And I think everybody should allow the narrative to evolve together through conversations that maybe are very hard for you to participate in or to accept, but that's the only way for a healthy narrative to move forward. And I think that if you're asking very generally what's lacking, I think that it's not lacking completely. I think it exists in certain areas, but I think what's lacking is a more inclusive and tolerant conversation. And being able to say, okay, within the panel, I completely disagree with that person, here's what. But still having that conversation together at the same space.
Yeah, absolutely agree. That is something that we, yes. Thanks so much for this, and we might go back to this point later. Actually, I would like to transition to Verena first. Verena is a PhD student that's focusing on understanding the social aspect of do-it-yourself biology community in 3 different countries in her studies, so Germany, Canada, and UK, right, Verena? And through interviews. Unfortunately, she cannot travel due to COVID to do-it-yourself community labs, but she's doing interviews right now. But she also in contact with governmental bodies. And regarding this, like, way to approach and way to surveil these movement citizens or do-it-yourself biology. So what are the difference in managing or supervising the do-it-yourself bio communities that you found in your study so far on the countries that you're studying?
So it's really quite fascinating to research, and I've been doing this for about 4 years now, how DIY biologists are aiming to rework the boundary between science and public. So research used to be really confined to the institutional boundaries of military labs and academia and industry. And what happens when these research infrastructures become available to a wide audience? Is that desirable, or is it just really scary? So, and I research how these boundary redrawing attempts are received and governed in different countries. And there's so much I could say about it, but just to give you a quick glimpse, so in the US, and this is also kind of the case for Canada to a lesser degree, DIY biology is discussed under the umbrella of innovation and entrepreneurship. So naturally, the connotation is a lot more positive. And I think that comes with that narrative of the garage entrepreneur that revolutionizes the world really as a single individual. So if Bill Gates revolutionizes the computer sciences from a garage, why shouldn't DIY biologists be able to revolutionize biotechnology from a community laboratory or a private bathroom laboratory? So that's a narrative that just keeps popping up. It's quite interesting how much currency it holds and how predominant it is, especially in the US and even in Canada. So you have that North American tradition. And really how DIY biology is received, responses vary so widely. So in Germany, like in many European countries, DIY biology is discussed as a matter of biotechnology risks. So it's really framed within a regulatory context. And naturally, if you frame it under risks instead of innovation, the topic is approached really differently, right? And that has a huge impact on how media reports about DIY biology and how people on the street will think about it. And it's what I research as well. I also look at just publics and media. So, and especially Germany is really quite attached to the precautionary principle, where they really take a very extensive approach to evaluating the risks of science and technology, and are really cautious about adapting any technology if they're not quite sure what the future effects will be. So if there's a chance that it could have negative effects, they are holding back. So it in effect places the burden back on DIY biologists to prove that what they're doing is not dangerous. So yeah, and of course, it's not easy to simplify this topic. Say it's DIY biology is celebrated in the US and it's vilified in Germany. It's not the case. There's lots of people who are really enthusiastic about DIY biology in Germany, and there are people in the US who are quite critical of it. So and in my research, I want to draw attention to the political and historical context in which DIY biology communities grow into. And also what I found quite interesting about the unnatural selection series is it's always there, but it's never quite made explicit, and that is the impact of the quite disastrous US American healthcare system. Because I think a lot of the DIY biologists wouldn't be doing what they're doing if the US American healthcare system wasn't reinforcing socioeconomic inequalities like it is. Take, for instance, the Open Insulin Initiative in the US, which is trying to make insulin available to a large public. When I tell Europeans about this initiative, they're quite puzzled because why exactly do you need that? Seems rather dangerous, but to many US Americans, that would be the way to have access to a life-saving drug that they depend on. So I think we need to make it more explicit what is fueling these projects really. Yeah. So yeah, but it's fascinating to study DIY biology, and it's one more instance where we can learn about how science and tech is always enmeshed with historical and political and cultural context, and how innovation doesn't just travel around the world to be adapted more or less seamlessly, more or less successfully. Yeah,
absolutely. And this, Beth, you were really excited what Andrea was saying. Do you want to add something or no? Okay, and yes, and but this is really the challenge, right? Like there are different countries that have different ways to see these, because they come from different from different environments, different culture, different way to have welfare states or do things. So it's really a challenge. Jenny, you're part of the World Economic Forum or so, right? Of synthetic biology. So you have kind of an overview on this. What's your take on these international aspects of synthetic biology?
Yeah, so exactly. Yeah, so I'm currently the fellow of the World Economic Forum's Global Futures Council on synthetic biology. And it's interesting because the four kind of, a lot of our work as a council, which is a new council, it's the first time the World Economic Forum has had a council on synthetic biology. And we're really theming a lot of our work around futures in terms of effectively four values, which have come up again from many panelists here, which is equity, sustainability, humility, and solidarity. And so what would a future of synthetic biology look like that embodies and takes into account those four aspects? And so, yeah, I mean, from a kind of zoomed out perspective, I think there's a real interest in, we're specifically talking about synthetic biology, but of course the boundaries of that are quite porous, so it bleeds into many other aspects of biotechnology as well, really thinking about at a global scale, what is this going to look like? And so the themes that we're talking about here are definitely repeating in those kind of conversations around, you know, we've had specific work on the changing geographies of innovation. What does it look like going forward, and where are we going to see innovation coming from? How can we change the environment and the policy environment and the economic resource flows to make sure that that direction is not staying on the same tracks, but we are seeing you know, different areas of the world being able to innovate. We're looking also at kind of revisiting some of the promises of synthetic biology, and you know, that's something we kind of have to do quite frequently for any technology. There's a lot of hype, there's always a lot of kind of promises made, and so to really reflect on what actually has been delivered, you know, do we need to take a somewhat more humble approach? Very difficult, as Leo said, on in terms of people have a lot of skin in this game. There's a lot of funding going around, there's a lot of work that's gone in, and so you know, humility is difficult when you kind of have to big up the technology to get your funding, or to get sort of through regulatory approvals, or to change policies, to change the future of the trajectory. So yeah, there are lots of big questions being asked. I don't think the council has any answers right now, but there's a big overlap between what we're discussing in this panel and what's being discussed at these very high level forums as well, because they're all key and critical questions for the future of engineering biology.
Thanks, Jenny. Is there, I don't know if there are questions. Yes, okay. There is only one question, which is that appear on YouTube, which is like, I know there are a lot of advantages about biotechnology, such as genetic engineering, but what are the thoughts on the misuse of it and how this can be stopped? A small question, an easy question. Who wants to take this? Maybe we can start. I don't know. Is anybody? I know, like Jenny, you wrote a book on biosecurity, like, and Beth, maybe you have some takes on it because you are actually running a lab that is outside academic setting. I don't know.
Yeah, I'll share my 2 cents from a DIY bio community lab perspective, and that's that academics can do a whole lot more damage than community scientists can. So generally speaking, like the nature of the space is very much about open sharing, transparency, accountability. Like the nature of this place is a place where people are really honest about like what they don't know and where they want to go and what they want to learn. And again, we operate under pretty strict like safety guidelines. We follow the same federal guidelines that university labs follow in terms of chemical safety and biological safety. And so like what we do here is in I love it, of course, but in the grand scheme of things, it's like fairly mundane. So the risks from GenSpace's perspective, for example, are really minimal. Like we do our due diligence to make sure waste is taken care of appropriately and blah, blah, blah. But the bigger question about misuse of the technology really comes to me around like, what is our sense of social responsibility? Who are we accountable to? And how do we understand our relationship to each other and to the natural world? And that's really the critical question to me. And I think as long as we can continue to cultivate a sense of like, we're all in this together, hopefully we can avoid some of those risks.
Absolutely, and if I'm not mistaken, in your mini-series on natural selection, Leo and Joe, there is an example of this in which the public actually stopped, like a suggestion on how I'm thinking about the gene drive in New Zealand to get rid of rats, right? And how that actually was stopped by public opinion, basically, right?
Well, I think it's more was stopped by a change of governments, not by the community there. The community was willing to keep talking about it. And there were different opinions within the community, and there were definitely people who were against moving forward. But I think the community in general agreed to keep talking about it and see what the possibilities are. Change of governments, I think, was more the reason why some research was halted, or I'm not accurate about it, maybe defunded. I'm not exactly sure what was the story. But I would like to add maybe one thing about how we negate risk, and that has to do a little bit with what I said before and a little bit what everybody's talking about, that I think in general as a society, I think the best way to negate a lot of risks is to demand that things are done in daylight. And in that sense, in that specific sense, I share the fact that I'm less scared about the DIY open labs, and I am a little bit more concerned about corporations and the amount of money that they can make on certain things, and how they're less prone for an open conversation, or less, there's less ways to surveil and understand what they're doing. And this is not necessarily in terms of being scared of some kind of apocalyptical thing that will happen from what they're doing. It's not that. It's more about how society, in terms of society, economically, how you move forward certain things with these kind of amount of money invested in expectations. How does that dictate how you do things? And this is, if there's something that I think Joe and I both our biggest maybe concern after doing the show and speaking with so many people, definitely the kind of concerns that we have had before doing the show as kind of novice people who didn't understand the technology, definitely shifted from being afraid of the technology or having concerns about the technology itself to more being concerned about interests. And I think interest is the biggest problem. And I think that somehow, and I'm not sure how, we have to make sure as a society with these kind of technologies that obviously on one hand, money is needed and investments are needed in order to innovate, but somehow we have to make sure that they're not monopolized, controlled, done in the dark, and there's answers to the public in every step.
Thanks, Leo. Yeah, absolutely. And Verena, you raise your hand. I think you're muted. Thanks.
I have a question for Joey and Lior, if you don't mind. So yeah, I was wondering how you picked the DIY biologists you portrayed in the series, because having a lot of contact with the DIY biology community, I think it doesn't get more controversial than the guys you picked. So I was wondering how you came to that decision.
Joe will answer, but I'll just say they were first. We started very early, but go ahead, Joe.
It's true. I mean, around the time that we really started our research was around the time that Josiah Zahner started selling kits. You know, so I mean, but of course, we're also making a film or making a series that you know, what ends up on the film and what ends up in the series is not a lot for each story, and you want to sort of bring to the public the main sort of points that then can create a discussion. Like I started the conversation, we know there's a lot of nuance. We know that there's a lot of nuance within the biohacking community and DIY community that we aren't able to get into in a 4-episode series. But I think what one thing that really stood out with Josiah and then with David Ishii, the dog breeder in Mississippi, is that whether or not you agreed with what they're doing, or whether or not you agreed with their tactics, or whether or not there was, you know, and so we wanted, they were a good example to bring to the discussion to the table of democratization versus regulation. Now, some could say that, well, democratize doesn't mean that you then can do the certain things that they were doing, or you know, gene editing, trying to gene edit their dog, or and make him glow, or sell CRISPR kits. But as a symbol, they bring that discussion to the table. And so, you know, when we wanted to basically take the audience on the roller coaster that we went on as filmmakers. And that is, yeah, when you first hear about a guy in Mississippi, rural Mississippi, trying to genetically engineer his dogs to glow in the dark, or a guy in Oakland selling CRISPR kits out of his garage, we were afraid of that. We were worried about that. We wanted to, and so we go and we spend time with them, and we film with them, and we learn from them, and start to say, wait, they start explaining the interests and the monopolies and the corporations and how powerful this technology is. Not that, you know, we didn't understand that, but you start to say, yeah, you know, wait, we need this in the hands of the guy in Mississippi. Who's by the way an amazing guy and a very intelligent person and doing really interesting and cool work, but as we found out. But and so then you go to the mainstream scientists and you talk to them, and they say, well, look, here's the problem with everybody in the world getting their hands on this technology, and what if there is a glowing fruit fly that gets out of the lab that has a gene drive in it, and now all our fruit flies are glowing around the world. So, you know, it's a discussion, and we tried to weave back and forth, and to get back to your original question, I think Josiah and David do a really good job of enabling that discussion. And then we're one last thing, and then in terms of the Leo, are you going to get into Aaron and Tristan? And is that
you go ahead? I'll say something else after.
Is that, you know, a lot of the mainstream scientists, not a lot. We had a lot of support from mainstream scientists. Some of them questioned why we included biohackers at all in the story, and you know, basically we're in these offices with mainstream scientists, and they're saying to us, we can't allow this to be. What if someone does something crazy in their garage, and then it stops the science, it stops the progress. We get regulated, you know, like crazy, and it's because, you know, some guy did something he didn't understand in his garage. And so here on the other side, if you've seen the series, we have the guys who are trying to create a cure for HIV, and as you'll see, a little bit in over their heads, as you can imagine, and here's an example in our face, you know, as filmmakers, of here's what these guys are talking about. So we need to show this. We need to see all sides of what can happen with this technology. And so to show, yes, maybe these guys certainly weren't, you know, didn't have the credentials, and certainly don't have the PhDs and so you wonder, should they be doing this? Well, we wanted to show what can also potentially happen in that way, which is putting some people in real danger by injecting themselves with something that maybe they don't understand.
Yeah. Just want to add to that, and it has to do with that story, that eventually, and this is maybe for everybody to know in terms of making films and making it into films, is that Josiah and David are very open people that allow for their self-criticism and your own criticism to come into their lives. So eventually, when we not only choose who we're filming, but also decide if we continue filming somebody, of course, as filmmakers that are trying to create interesting, continuous, in-depth debate, we will keep shooting. We will with people who are allowing us to come into their own dilemmas and to their own experiences. And in that sense, what Josiah and David went through during the time that we were filming was a lot for them. And it was new to the whole field. It was the first time the whole field is experiencing with these ongoing real ethical dilemmas in front of how the little things that they spread are growing. And they allowed us to keep filming us and bring us into the conversation while they're having second doubts of what they did at all. And that's really eventually what makes an interesting film about a subject, is people who are willing to open the doors and let you into everything that they're doing, including when they feel that maybe they did something wrong. And that's the main cause of choosing them to leadership.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you did. I mean, yes, as a scientist, I'm always like, always stressed about talking about biohackers. It's always like, but I acknowledge we have to talk with them, to them. So I would like just to ask a couple of questions that appeared on the YouTube chat. So I will skip one because I think we answered it online. But for example, I will skip on why would the general public need access to do-it-yourself biology? And maybe Lanchina, Beth, or Fernand might want to answer to this. Why the general public needs access to do-it-yourself biology? Even people working at unregulated lab doesn't seem very safe. So that's also do-it-yourself biology means that it's unregulated, and how we can regulate it, I guess. I don't know, maybe Lanchina, do you want to start? And then maybe...
Right. Okay, so I'll always go back. I'll always go back home because that's the best place. That's what I know best. So back home, DIY biology, it's not for fun. It's actually a necessity. So if you're looking at a lab where you have students taking a course that involves practicals in the lab, and you don't even have the resources, you don't have the equipment to train those students in. And there is an opportunity for you to build that from scratch with locally sourced materials. I think DIY biology becomes a necessity. It is not just for fun. So for us back in Cameroon, it is necessary because we need these things. The regulation, I think for now, I'll just try to liken it to Ochai getting a new toy. So for now, we won't really have an issue of regulation because we'd be too excited with the good we can do with it. It would take a bit of time for us to start thinking about or start trying different things out with what we have, because that's where the issue of regulation comes in. When the purpose is meant for, it is not being used for that. It is otherwise used for something else that's like negative. So for us, would embrace the positive side, and it will take a long while for us to start thinking about that. But I won't scrap off the fact that regulation is needed. But for us, we are delighted with what it can do to help us rather than what we can do that will maybe cause harm or other negative stuff.
Thanks, Lanchina. Absolutely. And maybe going in a lab in US, like community lab, why is do-it-yourself biology needed? Like Beth.
I wanted to give Fernand space to chat too.
Fernand first, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
No, please go ahead. Please go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah. For me, it's both a place of like profound learning. Like Lenchina said, so many students don't get access to hands-on lab. Like it's not a thing in many high schools and many universities even. So we work with like our art and design schools. They don't have lab classes. Like, so where else in the world can you do this? And that is a pretty important thing to me, to understand the technology by using it is such a deeply, profoundly life-changing learning experience. So that's one. And then the other piece of it to me is very true to like the interdisciplinariness of what we do. And it's, again, when you bring together a fashion designer with a biotechnologist with a computer engineer, they make things that are just weird and surprising and amazing and like stuff that you just wouldn't come up with if you were just biologists in a university lab. So I think those two elements of like truly real learning and then this funky innovation thing that happens when you bring people together, like those are the reasons why we exist.
Fernand? Maybe I'm aware of time, so probably this will be the last answer.
Yes, well, we work on academic labs, but we have been following the DIY bio community very closely because we learn a lot from them, and we learn about the instruments and protocols and interdisciplinary workshops. To me, DIY bio doesn't mean unregulated. I think actually the point is that they are seeking and making a big effort to be regulated in the same way that an academic lab or a company or a startup is regulated, as far as I know. And second, to me, the DIY, the do-it-yourself, is more related to the freedom, to the point of why we have a system of why having access and freedom to the way we create knowledge, so we can create knowledge from different perspectives, and we can own knowledge and the infrastructure that generated, so we can all create this more diverse technology and science. And I think DIY to me is more related to that, specific to that point.
Thanks, Fernand. Maybe we can just yes, no, last question, and then we go. Normal science is regulated. We have to feel risk assessment and genetic modification, modified organism risk assessment. Is it the same in a community lab? Maybe Beth and Jenny, because Jenny was also the director of a community, is the director of the community lab, community lab in Cambridge. So do you actually have to feel risk assessments as well?
Yes. Yes. So we have Cambridge Biomakespace, which is Cambridge's community lab. So if any of you on this call are inspired and would like to learn, because I completely agree with Beth. I mean, the reason to have it is that there is nowhere else to access practical biotechnology education outside of a formal educational setting. There are no adult education courses in biotechnology, certainly not ones where you can get hands-on with practical work. So unless you want to do a degree or kind of go back to do formal qualifications, there's really no access to this fundamental technology. And like in a Cambridge context, we're a life sciences hub. So there are tons of people who would like to work in the life science industry in Cambridge who already do and want to get hands-on. And so the sort of lifelong learning aspect is super important. But yeah, I mean, all of the labs that I'm aware of have GMO regulations of their own. Depends on where they're located. So in the US, the kind of legal structure is a little bit less regulated than in the UK, but that doesn't mean the labs are not responsible and have the paperwork in place and the training and everything is done properly. And I was involved last year in writing a biosafety handbook for these labs. But in the EU and UK, we actually have to register with the Health and Safety Executive as a GM centre, which means that we could be inspected at any time. We have to keep all the records. So just because you're outside of an academic institution, it doesn't mean that you're not subject to the same laws and regulations. And so all of the spaces in those regimes, those regulatory regimes, have to do effectively the same thing as a startup company would do. And you can imagine there are tons of like industry startups that have 2 or 3 people working in a small lab. And we do the same, we do basically the same as they do. And all of our projects go through the risk assessment process with our biosafety team. And I know that process is, you know, some labs are quite small and only have a few people, some are bigger, but they all have something in place to do that. So, and this is another reason to go back to other people's points, that it's actually, in terms of misuse and even kind of accidental things coming out of labs that were undesirable. In a community lab context, it's quite difficult because there's a significant amount of oversight by other community members, and it's impossible to hide what you're doing because there are people around all the time kind of seeing you working. And so yeah, it definitely is regulated, and we definitely do a lot of risk assessments. If anyone who's watching this also is very experienced risk assessments and would like to give us a hand, we would love to hear from you because we're always looking for new members for the biological safety team.
I mean, Beth, I see you agree a lot on it. So you have to you're compiling a lot of risk assessments as well. That's great, good. and Lancina, is it? I know Mboa Lab does have risk assessments, like does compile risk assessments. Cameroon, a bit health and safety.
Yes, it does. So anything the other labs like they do have, but now the issue would be the regulation. So it's on paper that they would have like regular visits and stuff, but I'm not actually sure that those responsible would go there to check what's happening. So it's very possible that we could like make a human being in the Mboa lab and no one would actually know. So yeah, I'm just being honest here. There are things we haven't put in place, but those responsible, I'm not sure. So it's
it's a process. It's a process. That's why we are talking about this, right?
Yeah.
We have to talk about it. We have to make. It's a plea for people that can decide these things and write politics about it. Sit down and think about it, because this is happening and is happening now, and it will happen more and more in the future years and in future decades. We need to think how to tackle these challenges everywhere in the world. So that's why we're having this discussion. So I'm aware we are 8 minutes over. So I let you go in the weekend, Easter weekend, to have holidays and relax. And thanks a lot for everybody that listened to this. And thanks a lot for the panelists. Thanks a lot for your time. And see you soon, probably for another event on VTSF Biology sometime soon.